Shalom, and welcome to Episode 3 of the Great Tribulation, He-Goats and Scapegoats. I'm your host, Marshall Masters, publisher of Jesus and the Third Temple, and this 13-part series is made possible by Your Own World Books and features author Robert Ryland. And now we begin with the first part of Episode 3, He-Goats and Scapegoats. Well, Bob, in this episode, He-Goats and Scapegoats, we're going to start off with the Heifer's Gangway Bridge, and it doesn't matter if you're waiting for the first Messiah or the second coming of the same Messiah. Either way, no red heifer ashes, no deal, right?
The temple has to be purified by the ashes, and people who are going to conduct certain ceremonies, not all, but certain most holy ceremonies have to be purified by the ashes of the heifer. Also, if someone walks across a dead body or works on a dead body like an undertaker, they would have to be purified by the ashes afterwards.
So the bottom line with the red heifer and the red heifer ashes is this is a matter of equal importance, I would emphasize, for both Christians and Jews.
Yes, this is a picture of the crucifixion, the resurrection, and the ascension of Messiah. For Jews, it's a mysterious ceremony. In fact, King Solomon, they approached him and they asked him, "What is it with the red heifer ceremony? We don't understand it." And he said, "Everyone certainly would agree that the Lord has blessed me with wisdom, but I surely do not know." And the reason for that is simple. Solomon didn't know his 23rd removed grandson, who was Messiah.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Christians know all about Yeshua ben Yosef from Nazareth, and his crucifixion fits this ceremony exactly. It's in Numbers chapter 19. And when you read it, you see the picture. I mean, at least Christians do. I mean, here you take a pure, unblemished animal that's never even had so much as a cloak thrown across its back, and it's in the prime of her years, maybe 2-3 years old, and she has no more than one red hair on her body or she's disqualified. If she had 2 white hairs, sorry, no deal.
Well, does God look the other way if we use hair coloring?
You have rabbinical thought. It says on certain occasions there could be some plucking.
So there's where there's a will, there's a way. But let me ask you this, okay? Here's the question. When I'm thinking about the Heifer's Gangway Bridge, what comes to my mind is, would Jews be, in quotation marks, I use the word clean, if they're walking on the ground?
No.
Okay.
If they were to perform some kind of a holy ceremony, as I say, maybe enter certain parts of the temple, they would have to be cleaned by the ashes of the red heifer. But I would like to go back just a bit. We stopped in the middle of the picture of the red heifer. Here we have this perfectly clean animal that's innocent and so forth, a living being, and we kill it. And we use its blood to mix with other things and living water that's being stirred and poured at the same time. And we sprinkle it on people, all of whom are sinful in some way.
Mm-hmm.
Does this remind you of somebody?
Mm-hmm.
Messiah.
Okay.
That's why Christians see this picture, or should see this picture right away, although I have to admit, and you would not be surprised, that I have been ridiculed.
As one heretic to another, hey, what are you gonna do, right?
Right. The evangelical commentary says, it's just an obsolete Jewish ritual.
It's worth their while to be blind.
Oh, brother. They're so blind.
But we know that. We know that's what they're saying, so why bother messing with that? This whole concept of the gangway bridge, what is with this gangway bridge?
They have never found a crumb, a remnant of the Heifer's Gangway Bridge.
Mm-hmm.
They found some remnants of the Azazel Bridge, where the scapegoat was led out of the city.
Mm-hmm.
Never found one piece of the Heifer's Gangway Bridge, and it was a remarkable landmark. It was very beautiful, if you can picture it in your mind, these stone arches, and there are two levels of them, and they alternate.
Mm-hmm.
That way, you will always be walking with air between you and the ground down in the valley below, where, of course, is the cemetery.
Mm-hmm.
VIPs were entitled to cross that bridge, not just your average Israeli Joe citizen.
Okay, now, so when you're on the bridge, there's a procedure there. So, obviously, there's a lot of law here. Is there a law for how you get across this gangway bridge?
The only restriction that I know of about crossing the bridge is when they took the heifer from the temple over to the Mifkad altar near the summit of the Mount of Olives.
Mm-hmm.
The priests who led the heifer walked backwards so that they would not turn their back on the temple, because that is an abomination. And you read about God's furious reaction to that in Ezekiel chapter 8. Some priests were standing in front of the temple looking into the sun with their backs to the temple. He didn't like that at all.
That is some great history on that bridge. Now, let's move from heifers to goats. And there was something here about two he-goats.
Right.
So we know the red heifer represents one thing. Obviously, the goats have to represent something else. So who do the two he-goats represent? What's their type?
I thought you'd never ask.
Okay.
The only Christians would probably understand this from the gospel. The two he-goats, one of them represents Messiah,
Mm-hmm.
who was the anointed one to be slain for the sins of all men.
Mm-hmm.
The other one was one who was just like him and who was released.
Mm-hmm.
And the goats were supposed to be the same size, the same color, and it says, and if they were purchased on the same day, it is a merit.
It's a merit?
Yes.
What's that mean?
It means it was good. That's a good thing.
All right. So,
The priest has this kalpe urn, and they threw these two stones in there, the lot pieces, and on one of them it said, for the Lord, and on the other one it says, for Azazel, meaning scapegoat in Hebrew.
okay.
He closes his eyes and reaches down into the kalpe and brings out two lot pieces. And like I told about Simeon the righteous, who reigned for 40 years as chief priest,
Mm-hmm.
every year the lot piece for the Lord came up in his right hand. And after that, if it came up in the right hand, it was looked at as a good omen. But anyway, the goat that was opposite the hand that had for the Lord was the one whose throat was going to be slit, and he was going to be burned upon the Mifkad altar. Whereas the other one, the Azazel, or what we call the scapegoat, we've turned the term scapegoat completely around, 180 degrees.
If there's one thing Jews have been for the last few thousand years, are scapegoats.
The Jews are scapegoats in the cultural way we have twisted this term, but in the Jewish law, the scapegoat is the one that is released and takes Israel's sins out into the wilderness
All right.
and goes into becoming a wild goat. They watch to see that no little shepherd's boys take him over or anything like that. And as we said, when he reached the wilderness and was released during the time of Simeon the righteous, that red strap hanging on the gate of the temple would turn white as snow.
With the actual term scapegoat itself, it is completely and totally misunderstood
Right.
by Christians and actually Jews as well,
Yeah.
because what it really was a contraction of two words, escape and goat.
Right. They've turned it completely around.
Wow. So we have the two he-goats. The one that was there a way for them to select between the two he-goats, which one would,
No.
it was just luck of the draw.
Right. It was the lot pieces that the high priest pulls out of the calpe. Whichever one had the lot piece that was opposite the two goats in front of him, well, the goat that was opposite the hand that had the lot piece that said for the Lord was the one that was going to be slain.
Okay. All right. Well, let's do this in the next segment. You talked about the heifer's gangway bridge
Huh?
and that there was a specific way for the heifer to be taken somewhere. And now I'm really interested to see if there's another similar situation with the scapegoat or the scapegoat, if you will. Let's pick that up in the next segment, okay?
All right.
To learn more about Jesus and the Third Temple by Robert Ryland, please visit JesusandTheThirdTemple.com. And now we continue with the second part of Episode 3, He-Goats and Scapegoats. Well, Bob, now I'm kind of interested about this scapegoat or the scapegoat. The Jews have had thousands of years of being scapegoats. The scapegoat is the one that is like the president pardoning a Christmas turkey.
Right.
But how was this creature taken away, and how did they live out the rest of their days?
One of the priests was assigned to take the scapegoat out into the wilderness and to carry Israel's sins. That was what he represented.
Mm-hmm.
And the crimson strap that had been tied under his throat to his horns was hung on one of the gates of the temple. And when the priest reached the wilderness, far enough away where he was sure that there weren't going to be any little shepherd boys that were going to take over this goat, he was to be released into the wild, into the wilderness, completely free.
Mm-hmm.
And when that happened, the crimson strap that hung on the temple during the time of Simeon the Righteous would turn white as snow. And that was a real miracle.
Mm-hmm.
But he was just released into the wild.
Mm-hmm.
And he wasn't expected or probably ever seen to return to Jerusalem again. He probably preferred it out there where he was.
Was he marked in a special way so people would know that this was an scapegoat or scapegoat?
No,
No?
no, no.
Was there a special conveyance? In other words, how exactly were they taken away? Was there like the heifers? You had a bridge for the heifers? Did you have a bridge for the scapegoat?
Yes, the Azazel bridge was the bridge for the scapegoat. Azazel is the Hebrew for scapegoat, of course. And they found remnants of that bridge a couple of decades ago, I believe, but not much of it. But they've never found a shred of the heifer's gangway, not one.
That's interesting. Another thing comes to mind. Is there a cultural precedent here for Barabbas? In other words, Barabbas essentially was the scapegoat.
Exactly. And it was, I bet you, he was the same height and weight and the same hair coloring. He was probably Jesus' double.
Whoa.
They probably had the same build. They probably might even had the same color gown on. Their sandals probably the same type.
Mm-hmm.
And here they were standing in front of Pilate. And Pilate was taking part of the high priest, and he had to select one of these. And the crowd, of course, represented the reaching into the lot to see who was going to be the one that was going to be slain. And they shouted at Pilate's request, "Who do you want me to pardon for the Passover weekend?" And they said, "Barabbas, Barabbas." And so Barabbas was the scapegoat, and Jesus was for the Lord. And he was slain on the Mount of Olives.
Then the next question I have is when you're talking about the sacrifice of the goat, how exactly was that done? Where exactly was the altar where the goat was offered up to God?
I haven't really been able to determine where the goat for the Lord was slain. I believe it was in the temple, but I haven't been able to document it. One of the main reasons I believe that is the only other animal that I know of that was slain at the Mifkot altar, the red heifer. The sin bullocks and other offerings and so forth were not slain at the Mifkot altar. They took all of the ashes out of the ash bin of the altar and took them up to the Mifkot altar and dumped them, and they poured down the hill. The interesting little thought here is if you think about what is the most recognizable remaining bone structure of an animal after you burn it, the skull.
Right.
No wonder they called it Golgotha. About 1 million animals had been sacrificed there in 1,000 years of temple worship.
Uh-huh.
And the place probably didn't smell too good either because there was a lot of scorched flesh that was probably mixed in with the ashes.
Yeah.
Not a pretty sight.
Not much of a pretty sight indeed. I guess that's just the business of it. But there was also something you had discussed in the book about 5 events. What were those 5 events?
Well, some of this is speculation on my part, but I believe that since Abraham was down at Beersheba, when he was on his way to Jerusalem, to the land of Moriah, to a mountain that I will show thee, the Lord told him. And it says, and he saw the place from afar off. Well, when you're standing on the summit of Masada, which is at about the same ground level as Beersheba, they point out to you sometimes, you can see Jerusalem from here. Oh, where? Well, you see that bump right there? The highest bump on the horizon over there? That is the Mount of Olives. It's the highest point in the area of Jerusalem. The Temple Mount is one of the lowest peaks in the area. He could not have seen that from afar off. And before anybody jumps up, and geologists have confirmed that the terrain in that area, despite all the landslides and earthquakes, has not changed that much over the last 2,000 years.
Okay.
So Abraham saw the Mount of Olives, and that's where it took Isaac to offer him. And he found this spot, which was right opposite the Temple Mount, which they call Mount Moriah. And then the next thing that happened there was ashes were burned there. That red heifer was burned there, and all the ashes were poured out. Then the ascension of Yeshua was there, because that's where he was also crucified. And Shekinah sat there for 3.5 years, pleading with the people to return unto me, and I will return unto you. And then he ascended from that same place. The way we can tell that is since Asher Kaufman, a professor whom we're going to talk about later, located the Holy of Holies, you can survey these places in. Because they were a Sabbath limit from the Holy of Holies. That was called out of the camp. And outside the camp was one Sabbath limit from the Holy of Holies. There were 3 camps, however, but the most distant camp was the one I'm speaking of.
If there is similar evidence of the altar itself, where it was located, then that in turn would tell us exactly where the 3rd temple needs to be located. Correct assumption?
3rd temple needs to be located somewhere that's acceptable to Islam and Judaism, and I don't think that's on the Temple Mount under the present conditions.
Hold on a second. If Islam is the one driving the conversation, then it's pretty pointless for us. I'm talking about this is a matter for the Israelis to decide. If they're going to build the 3rd temple so that the altar is going to be sitting exactly where it was sitting with the 2nd temple, and that's up on the Temple Mount. And the reason why I'm asking, because I know that the Muslims have been digging through the Temple Mount so much that they've actually caused one of the walls to weaken. And it took a tremendous amount of effort to get that thing stabilized. So my question to you is, are the Muslims as interested as to where this altar was located as Jews and Christians should be?
No.
Really?
because the Temple Mount is one thing, and the Mifkad altar is one Sabbath limit straight east of the Holy of Holies up on the western slope of the Mount of Olives.
All right.
But if you're not going to have the temple on the Temple Mount where Asher Kaufman's threshing floor is, then they have to find another place in order to conduct the ceremonies. I think that's what will happen.
Why is the walk digging underneath and literally wrench out the bowels of the hill?
I don't know what they're looking for. Well, it's ironic. The Muslim skip loader was scraping a place for a road to asphalt, and he uncovered a whole bunch of ashlars.
Mm-hmm.
And an Israeli archaeologist went out there and saw them, and he photographed them and stuck them in a folder and put out a note to other archaeologists, including Asher Kaufman. And Asher Kaufman had been working on this for a long time. And when he saw those photographs, that was it, because the Muslim skip loader guy had uncovered eastern wall of the temple court, the entrance to the women's court.
Mm-hmm.
And they covered it up right away with asphalt, and you can't look at anything up there now.
Where is that in relationship to the Dome of the Rock?
It's about 110 meters northwest of the threshing floor.
Mm-hmm.
This court, foundation stones, would be just about be northeast of the Dome of the Rock.
All right. If the Jews wanted to build the third temple on the Temple Mount, then aside from the issue of building next to a Muslim shrine, but still the same, they would be able to build the temple in an area of the Temple Mount where there is no structure of importance.
They could resume the temple worship without being on the Temple Mount.
Okay.
Like they did when they came back from Babylon.
All right.
And like they did when they entered the Promised Land. They could have a tabernacle anywhere in Israel.
Okay.
They don't have to be up there on the Temple Mount and use the Mifkad altar and so forth until later. When Messiah comes, then for sure the temple will be sitting on its rightful place, and there won't be no Dome of the Rock. It will have been knocked down by the earthquake, and the Mifkad altar, my late wife Beth and I stood at it, and there's a picture of it in my book, the place that I think is the Mifkad altar, because it fits the description that's in Talmud. It looks as though someone took a bulldozer and cut a shelf out of the western slope of the Mount of Olives at about one Sabbath limit from the threshing floor that Asher found.
So then, in summation, we can say the third temple, build it wherever you want to build it in Israel, right?
Right.
The fourth temple, however, it's going to be sitting where the second temple was sitting.
Exactly, and where Solomon's temple was sitting.
Okay.
There is, however, a difference in orientation of Solomon's temple and the second temple. Solomon, their astronomers weren't quite as astute, and they were about 6 or 8 degrees off on the direction of the axis of the temple. But they corrected that with the second temple. The second temple, the long axis of it points due directly straight, cotton picking, east.
Got it. Well, then at that point, we know the score. Third temple, it's pretty easy. You don't have to have a political issue.
No.
Fourth temple, that's it. And with the fourth temple, and the Dome of the Rock is flattened, one last curious question. What happens to Islam?
When Messiah comes, everybody in the world will have the same faith. He will dispense with those who are not loyal to him. In fact, a lot of them will be martyred during the tribulation. There aren't going to be very many people on earth when he arrives. And some of them might be Muslims, but they won't be Muslims very long because they will see that Muhammad was not the prophet, but that Messiah, son of David, is the Son of God. They will recognize that.
Okay. In the next segment, I'm curious why the number 6 is the number of man. I want to go back to biblical numerology. You up for that?
Right.
To learn more about Jesus and the Third Temple by Robert Ryland, please visit JesusandTheThirdTemple.com. And now we continue with the third and final part of Episode 3, He-Goats and Scapegoats. Okay, Bob, I've been curious about number 6 being the number of man. Is this rolling a 6 the hard way? Tell us about it.
It's not about boxcars.
Okay.
Man was created on the sixth day. 6 days to collapse the walls of Jericho. And of course, there are 6 points on the Star of David, the Magen David. 666 is the number of the most evil man ever to exist. That is, Antichrist, the beast, and so forth. And now he increases his evil deeds because he knows his time is running out.
Mm-hmm.
In a similar way, man will be given dominion over the earth for 6 days, 6,000 years, and then Messiah, the Son of God, will come and he will reign during the 7th day. And there will be a day, complete peace and harmony. There will be no pain, no disease, no sin. Everything will be like it was in the time of Adam. Perfect.
Back to the Garden of Eden.
Right. Now, we ask the question, man's 6 days. When are day 5 and 6?
Oh, I gotta hear about this.
We are approaching 7th day right now.
Okay.
We're nearing the end of the 6th day. The rabbis calculated, and Barnabas. Man has 6 days. There'll be 2 days from Adam until Abraham. And there will be 2 more days, that is 2,000 more years, from Abraham until Messiah, son of David, arrives. Well, that was what our calendars would call the 1st century.
Mm-hmm.
And there are many of us that say, well, he was already here, but there are many Jewish people that say, oy vey, we're still waiting for him. Where is he? So not long from now is going to be the 6th day, and then he will arrive. They said there were 2 Messiahs. Can you beat that? There was the Messiah, son of Joseph, and Messiah, son of David, and Messiah, son of Joseph, was killed. And because of our sin, Messiah, son of David, is delayed for 2 more days. And that's why they say he wasn't here when he was supposed to be, back on the 4th day. They have ways of twisting the Lord's word, and they're not alone in this. Protestants and Catholics do the same thing.
I've noticed.
But anyway, we are nearing the beginning of the 7th day.
All right.
The approach of Messiah, son of David, is not very far off. According to the calendar, we've just about finished up the 6th day.
All right. So this future, this next chapter, is our right. It is what we are destined to receive.
Yes.
But conversely, it is ours to lose.
We lost it when we had it, and now he's going to give it back to us. We lost it when Adam sinned,
Mm-hmm.
and now we are going to return to having a sinless world in a way God intended it in the first place.
Okay.
He's going to retrieve the world as it was and give it back to us for 1,000 years, only governed by his Son.
What happens 1,000 years after that, out of curiosity?
That's the end. The people who are written in the book of life will be taken to the New Jerusalem. Like I say, the Jewish people will be called up from the 4 corners of the earth, live or dead, up out of their graves, what I call the Jewish rapture. And that will be just 10 days before the arrival of Messiah. Messiah will arrive on the Day of Atonement, like it says in Zechariah, and they will look upon me, whom they have pierced, and they will mourn for him as for an only son. They will realize, oy vey, we made a big mistake. And one will ask him, what are these wounds in thine hands? And he will say, those I received in the house of my friends. Well, there's another little thing here that might intrigue you here, too, is there were 4 carpenters, according to Zechariah 2:3, and they consist of Melchizedek, who was a very holy man, priest, of ancient times, maybe even before Abraham. We're not sure. Nobody knows really very much about Melchizedek.
Mm-hmm.
And Elijah was a carpenter, and Messiah, son of Joseph, was a carpenter. Messiah, son of David, was a carpenter.
Mm-hmm.
And so there were 4 carpenters. Only wait a minute. 2 of those carpenters were the same fella. So really, there were only 3, I say.
Mm-hmm.
Messiah, son of Joseph, was really Messiah, son of David. Only the people who put him to death didn't realize that. But when he comes back and they see the wounds in his hands and talks with them a little bit, they'll remember, oh, yeah, okay. And so there are really only 3 carpenters. The significance that Jesus was a carpenter is shown in the Talmud in Sukkah 52.
Mm-hmm.
That's where I was looking it up. I think it's kind of an interesting little story. I wish we knew more about Melchizedek, but we just don't.
Okay. Was there any specific significance for Jesus being a carpenter?
Well, he was raised by a carpenter who adopted him, Joseph, and that's how he got his royal lineage, by the way,
Mm-hmm.
by the fact that Joseph adopted him. Mary was also descended from King David, but she was descended from the branch of the family that was forbidden to ever be anointed as kings. But he has the blood of David from Mary, but he doesn't have the blood from Joseph, but he has the adoption and the fatherhood from Joseph, which is within the Jewish law. And Joseph was descended from the royal family. And so that's how he gets it all. It's an intriguing little legal maneuver. People could dabble with this and have lots of fun.
Oh, yeah. No doubt that they could have some fun. But I think the lineage issue here is very interesting.
It's very important.
It does carry through to something that is consistent throughout. He was adopted.
Yeah.
Joseph was a carpenter, but had this royal blood.
Mm-hmm.
What's a carpenter doing with royal blood?
Not all of the descendants of royalty had big elite positions in life. It just happens that he was of that lineage.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't mean that he had to be a big wheel in Nazareth or anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
And Mary was descended from the unfortunately discredited branch of David's family. And nevertheless, she provided the bloodline to Jesus. And Joseph, from his lineage, by adopting Jesus, which was a legal way to become a father and have a son, was the way he inherited the lineage to the throne. So it's really fascinating.
So at that point, adoption law was pretty strong.
Oh, yes, it was very powerful. It's one of the most powerful legal documents there is. I have an adopted son.
Mm-hmm.
They made that one thing perfectly clear to us when we went through adoption. Now, this is final.
He's yours.
Right.
And with all that comes with it.
Exactly. You're responsible to raise him and take care of him and bring him up to be a responsible adult and do your best, although you might not always be successful. We got a lot of those around. But I think that's interesting, that story.
It is. Well, this has been a fascinating episode. Our next one coming up is finding the temple site. And my question leading into that next one is, did the anointing oil have any unique properties? And so we'll get into that in the next episode. Okie doke.
When we bring it up again.
This concludes Episode 3, He-Goats and Scapegoats. Next up, please join us for Episode 4, Finding the Temple Site. To learn more about Jesus and the Third Temple by Robert Ryland, please visit JesusandTheThirdTemple.com.